One thing I've always been interested in is how light creates shadows, and how the shadows and the light actually change the colors that you're looking at. Hi, I'm Barry Techmeyer. I'm a watercolor artist here in Kansas City, trying to be a little bit dramatic because the class I'm getting ready to teach is called Shadows and Light in Watercolor. Some of the things we're going to be doing in the class is we're going to be looking at how you can create clouds with silver linings, how you can paint a lamp that shines in the darkness. So if you're ready to experiment with a little bit of the dramatic in your artwork, get those paintbrushes ready, because we are going to be painting light and shadows in watercolor. From sunlight to streetlight, this class will explore painting contrasting value in watercolor. Learn how to use glazing to make subject matter glow, and underpaintings to develop deep and colorful shadows. We started with the introduction and class agenda, and then we're going to go into the supplies you're going to need for the specific activities we're doing. We're going to create a dark value through glazing, and then get into paint consistency from tea to butter. We'll be painting lamplight, and then finally we're going to create a landscape that has clouds with a silver lining. The first thing on our list of supplies is watercolor paper. This is Arches. It's 300 pound, which is very, very thick, and it's 9 by 12 inches, which is about the size we're going to need for our final painting. Most important thing when you are getting watercolor paper is that it's 100% cotton. A little later on, we're going to be going into the different sizes you're going to need to cut up for the different activities. But here are two of the sample pieces that I have cut up and painted on. Here I have my watercolor paper on top of my watercolor board, which is just basically a corrugated plastic piece. You can use a table if you want to. You don't have to have a board. And this is my Scotch blue tape. And here is how I tape it to that board. And I tape it to the board just to keep it secure. If you want to tape it to a table, you can. And I also know some artists that wet down the back and don't use tape at all. Here is my mechanical pencil. I had an artist talk about his mechanical pencil, and I bought one, and now I won't be without one. I just love drawing with it. Now let's talk brushes. This brush is from my favorite company. It's the Silver Black Velvet. This is a number 10. It's a round brush. Makes a nice point on the end. Now the one thing about the 10 is you need to understand that different companies have different numbers for sizes. This next one is from the Princeton company. I use it frequently as well. This is a number 6, but you'll notice it's not that much smaller than the number 10 was. Both are fantastic to make little details with. Again, they're round because the brush part is round. And we use these a lot when we're painting, so these are probably the two brushes I use the most. These are flat brushes. The black one is a Silver Black Velvet as well. The flat brushes are measured, so that's a 1/2 inch, and this is probably the most expensive brush I have. It is pure sable, and it is 3/4. I don't expect anybody to go out and buy one. This probably costs $60, and I got it on sale for half price, or probably even less than that. This is a rigger brush. We'll be using this a lot to paint little details and different things. The difference is that on the top of it, the brush part is a little bit longer. Now let's talk paint. For the activities we're doing, it's probably best if you use tube paint like I just showed you. and have some kind of palette. This is my favorite. This is a ceramic palette. And the best thing is to have a place where you can mix a lot of colors and a place where you can put your paints around the outside or in the wells, wherever they are. Now, so I remember where the colors are, I keep this guide for me that I've make up, and it usually changes over the date, so I put a date on the top of it. But this way I remember what the paint is, because sometimes they look very, very similar. And this is the gouache. This is titanium white gouache. Any brand will work for what we're doing. And it usually comes in a nice tube like this. And for the activities we're doing, I just leave it in the tube, take the lid off, stick my brush on the inside, and that works really well, especially for the paintings that we'll be doing. Two important things to remember while we're painting. You're going to need 2 containers of water, and also you're going to need a hairdryer. Make sure that the hairdryer can adjust its speed, because you don't want them to be too high. And the other thing you're going to need, of course, is you're going to need a paper towel, and we'll use that to wipe our brushes off with, and so we can soften some of the edges. So here are some specifics about the paper and the brushes you're going to need. You need 2 2x9 or similar pieces of watercolor paper, 1 4x6, which is postcard size, 1 6x9 or similar, and for the brushes you need a medium round, which is about a 6 or a 10, a medium flat, 1/2 inch, and a larger flat, about 3/4 inch. You could probably get by with just having the larger flat, and you need a rigger brush. Remember that your paper needs to be 100% cotton, probably cold press is the best, and Arches is the best brand. And here are specific paints that you're going to need: cerulean blue, cobalt blue, quinacridone gold, raw sienna, burnt umber, Payne's gray or neutral tint, and white gouache. There are several watercolor companies that I recommend. If you're using professional grade, which is more expensive, I always use Winsor Newton or Daniel Smith. Now, Winsor Newton has a student grade, which is less expensive, and the quality is pretty good, and that company is called Cotman. And then there's another company called Pelican that does student grade. Both are fantastic for beginners, and both have a pretty good choice of colors. For our first activity, we're going to be doing glazing. Glazing is layering watercolor and letting the layers dry between applications. We'll be using this process in both the paintings we do later. You will need a 2x9 inch or similar piece of watercolor paper, and marked out in about 1.5 inch spaces with pencil. I'm starting out by using a darker color. Probably the Payne's gray or neutral tint will work well in this situation. And what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to get a nice watery paint that you're going to be able to paint over the whole entire paper, and when it dries will be fairly light. This will be your underpainting when you're starting. So we're using our flat brush, and this is my 1/2 inch. I probably could have done this faster if I had my 3/4. But with a 1/2 inch, I'm just painting the whole thing. I go back and forth and up and down, filling in all the spaces, and trying to wipe out my brush strokes as I'm going. And it's okay to go back and dip your brush back into the paint and covering it. And remember that later on you are going to be covering this layer up. So if it's not exactly perfect, that's okay. It's just that top section that you're going to be showing without any other paint on top of it. But this is the first layer that you're creating. For the next step, grab your hairdryer and dry your paint completely. We'll be doing this between every layer, so keep that hairdryer handy. And now we're ready to officially begin glazing. So I'm taking that same paint that I mixed up, and I'm putting some more on my brush. So I'm putting this directly on top of what I painted. And you'll notice when I put this same color on top of the other color I painted, it is a little bit darker. So that's what happens when you glaze, is that you don't have to use a darker color. You can use the same color in layers and it makes it darker. Once again, it's important to dry that layer completely before moving on to the next. For the next layer, I decided to make it just a little bit darker, so I added some more paint to it to darken the value of it. When we're finished here, this is going to look like a value scale, so it will be the lightest value at the top and then working its way down to the darkest value at the bottom. So I wanted to make sure there was a definite contrast between the second and the third layers. And you can see how this is working, that you can definitely tell the difference between that second layer and the third layer. Repeating the process, and this time adding a little bit more pigment to make your value even darker. And making sure that you mix up plenty, because it does take a lot of the water and a lot of the paint to fill up that space. If you don't add enough water to it, you're going to end up coming back and mixing up some more, and it might change the value of the pigment that you're working with. Only 2 more layers left, and then our value scale and our glazing activity will be complete. And notice that I did add a little bit more paint to this, a little bit more pigment to make it darker, because I want to see a definite change as we're coming down. If it's getting too light, too fast, or if it gets too dark, too fast, it's not going to be a nice value scale with a gradiated change in that value. So I'm finished with the painting activity, and now what I'm going to do is take off the tape. One thing I find very satisfying about finishing anything in watercolor is when I pull off the tape and there's a nice crisp white line around the outside. But with this one, I think it really emphasizes the different values of the scale that you have here. As you can see, going from a very, very light gray to a very, very dark gray. Paint consistency is something that you will deal with in every painting that you do. For this activity, you're going to need a 2" by 9" piece of watercolor paper, taped down, and then divide it into 5 squares in pencil. Here are the different consistencies that we're going to be dealing with: tea, coffee, milk, cream, and then finally butter. Any darker color will work for this activity. I'm using cerulean blue, but any color will work. It's not the color that's important. What's important is the thickness or the consistency of your paint. To start out with, we're doing a tea consistency, which is more water than pigment. So I'm adding a lot of water to this pigment, so it's going to be a little bit lighter, as well as it's going to be very liquid. So if I hold up my palette, it will drip really quickly. Now I'm taking that same paint and I am putting it on the first square that is on my paper, filling it in. You can use this as a practice to kind of filling in and putting in a wash in a specific shape. But the one thing I want you to notice is how liquid this is. Once again, lifting up the board, you can see how it almost drips out of the square. The second consistency is coffee. We do not want to add any more water to this paint. We are just adding the pigment. And for coffee is a little bit thicker. It still has some of the drips that you're going to see, but not quite as loose as we saw the first time. With coffee, your paint is going to have a little bit more control. It's what I would use for skies, and possibly when I am doing a large wash of some kind. The next square will be milk consistency. It's a little bit thicker, as milk is, and we're just adding, once again, just adding the paint. And when you paint with this, you're going to notice you're going to have a lot more control. You can see how the paintbrush, when it comes across on the paper, it doesn't have as much give as the other time. Now this is what I probably paint with most of the time, is I paint with a milk consistency, and you will hear me talk about that when we get down to doing the paintings. So you'll notice it does drip just slightly, but it does not give anything like the tea or the coffee did. Our next is a cream consistency. We're going to add a lot more pigment this time because our paint is definitely going to be thick. We're going to notice a drastic difference. With the cream consistency, this is what you're going to paint a lot of details with. So you're going to want to have control. And you're probably using a smaller brush. So try using it with the tip of your paintbrush and see how you're able to really control the paint where it goes. You also notice how dark this is. So we have tea, coffee, milk, cream, and our last is butter, and it's a little bit different. For the butter, I'm going to dry my brush off a little bit because I'm going directly into the paint. There's no water, it's straight pigment. Your pigment will be a little bit damp, and then we're going right onto the paper. We call this dry brushing because basically there's no water on your brush and there's no water on the paper. and the paint makes a nice texture. So be listening for these consistencies as we do the painting activities. In creating a painting of lamplight, the first thing you're going to need to have is a good resource photo. One that has some detail, but the main thing is the contrast of the light up against the dark. Looking at the resource photo, you want to simplify it into the basic shapes. You do not want to draw too much of the detail before you begin painting. A ruler or straight edge is going to be a necessity. Especially when you're drawing the pole, you want it to be nice and straight. As you draw, think about the main shapes and think about how you can simplify your drawing. Before we start painting, you're going to want to wet down most of the watercolor paper. This can be done with a watercolor brush, or if you have a clean sponge handy, that will work as well. We'll start our painting by mixing up quinacridone gold and raw sienna. You'll take this color and paint it around the lamp. Since the paper is damp, this color should bleed out and create the glow effect around the lamp that we're looking for. If there are any other areas in your painting where there is going to be light shining through, such as windows or maybe a door, be sure to include that as well. To avoid making green in the sky, we're going to mix rose madder, lavender, and cerulean blue, and possibly a touch of cobalt. Mix this paint in a milk consistency, and you're going to paint over everything except for the glowing around your lamp. Paint over the buildings, paint over the ground. This will become your underpainting. It's a base coat of the main color that will be in your painting. We will be able to glaze over this several times to create the darkness in the painting. If there is any light reflecting on the ground in your painting or anywhere else, use the quinacridone gold and raw sienna mixture and paint it in the areas needed. Taking the cerulean blue mixture, make it a little bit thicker. Make the consistency more like milk as you're coming down. And this will enable you to create a glaze over the top of the underpainting and start seeing how it's going to darken that area. We'll be going over the sky area several times with several glazes to get at the darkness that we really need. Clean your brush really well and wipe it down with your paper towel so that you may soften the middle area in your lamp, also around the outside area where the blue is touching the glow. I want to mix up some more of the blue, and this time I'm going to include some cobalt to make it just a little bit darker. I'm going to take that mixture and I'm going to start doing another glaze right over the top of what I've just done, making sure that that bottom layer is dry before putting this layer on. We do not want this to be wet into wet. You want it to be wet on dry, where we have one dry glaze and we put a wet glaze right on top of it. Allow that to dry and we just continue going. Once that glaze dried, I realized it still wasn't dark enough. So I took three other colors. I took Payne's Gray, cobalt blue, and cerulean this time to make it even darker. Watercolor always dries lighter, which is why this painting is a challenge. I wanted the sky to be very, very dark, and after it dried with the hairdryer, I noticed it got even lighter. So I started again with some more Payne's Gray, cerulean, and also the cobalt, and this time it became even darker. Since I was pleased with the darkness or the value of this color, I'm going to go ahead and start fine-tuning some of the shapes that are in my painting, going around the glow and also the outsides of my buildings. Now it's time to start thinking about the ground and the buildings. I'm mixing up some quinacridone gold and taking some raw sienna and a little bit of burnt sienna and maybe a little bit of burnt umber and mixing it all together to get a dark brown. The color isn't as important here as what the effect is going to be when you're painting it. In this situation, there was a very rough road, I think it's made out of cobblestone, that I'm wanting to show the impact of it at night. In the darker areas, I'm taking my Payne's Gray now and mixing it with some burnt umber, so I have that same brown, but making it even darker so I can have those shadows stand out. Taking that dark color, I'm going to paint in my buildings. And then looking at my resource photo, the building on the left and the building on the right are very dark. However, there are more lamps down the street, so that's why some of the buildings down farther are lighter. I'm being careful to paint around those windows and doors. I don't want to paint over them. So it's called negative painting when you're painting around something like this, because you're painting in the negative space. Some of those windows and doors actually have like windowsills and different things that I'm going to add, created with just simple lines. I definitely want to show the contrast between the buildings and the ground, but but there's not as much contrast between the buildings and the sky, since the sky is still very dark. I lightened that color and added a little bit of cobalt blue to it, and that's what I'm using to paint the buildings that are in the middle. And I realized that there's one section of the sky that I forgot to paint, so I'm going to come back in and I'm going to have to match that color the best as I can. So I'm going to get dark very quickly here and fill in that section, being careful to paint around the post that holds my lamp on the top. Well, the buildings in the middle have some interesting textures on them because there are windows and some different things on the top with the roof, but I don't want to show too much of them because I don't want to overpower it with detail. My lamp is the main part of the story here. It is a center of interest. It's what I want to see. I believe this is probably the 5th time that I've gone over this with a wash and glazing it over with a darker color. I noticed that there was some texture in the sky that I didn't like, so I wanted to get rid of it. Now I'm taking that dark color, using my raw sienna mixed with a little bit of the Payne's Gray and the quinacridone gold. I'm using that and my rigger brush to outline the details in the lamp. Now some of that light from the lamp is coming down and shining on the pole, but there's also some pretty harsh shadows on it as well. So what I'm doing is carefully leaving some of that lighter color so that we can still see the lamp post, but we can also see the shadows. There's some rings around the post, so I put those in by putting some lines curved, not straight across. Since the post is curved, I want to show that contour by making those lines curved. Getting down here on the bottom part, it's a little bit more shadowed, and then taking some of that color and making a little bit of a shadow right at the bottom of the post. I wanted to increase the texture on the road. So what I did was I took my rigger brush and I added some thin lines of that same color kind of going through the light that's on the ground, but making it look like that is rough. Now I'm taking my rigger brush and coming in and drawing those lines to create those windows. Finish things out, I took my rigger brush and the white gouache. I took the white gouache straight out of the tube and added some small dots in the background where there's some more lights. And here's the finished painting. Before we do our landscape with the clouds with a silver lining, I thought it would be important for us to just talk briefly about how to paint clouds. I'm going to give you two different techniques. This first technique is called the wet cloud technique. And basically all you do to start this is to paint the clouds with water. Then come in with the blue paint. This is cerulean, and you're going to paint the sky. And what happens is the water from the clouds is going to mix with the blue from the sky and create a nice soft cloud. Now sometimes what I like to do is come in and soften the edges because some of the edges didn't get as fuzzy as I'd like. And I also like to come in and add some of the shadow, the shadow that's on the bottom of the cloud using a gray. My spritzer comes in really handy because that helps also with the softening, so you might try that as well. This technique I use mainly when I'm in a hurry or if I'm doing something quickly, and if the clouds are not the main part of the painting. In fact, both of these techniques I use when I'm going to be painting something else in front of the clouds, and that the clouds are not the main part of the painting. Even with spritzing and some of the other techniques I've done, I've noticed that there's some hard edges on the clouds. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my damp brush, wipe it off with my paper towel, and then I'm rubbing the edges to soften them. When adding the shadows to the clouds, you want to use a very light gray. What I did here was use neutral tint and then just added a lot of water to it. And I'm only adding this gray to the bottom of the clouds because that's where the shadow is going to be. The second technique is called a Kleenex lifting technique. And it starts out by getting the entire piece of paper wet, and then coming in with your cerulean blue or whatever blue you're going to use and covering the entire paper. And you want this to be not really dark, but darker than you would normally have it. And that's so that when you lift, you'll be able to see the clouds really easily. Taking your piece of Kleenex, you're going to just push that into the paper and lift it. Now you're going to want to change your Kleenex every once in a while so that you're not putting paint back down, that you're lifting up the paint into the Kleenex and looking at the shapes, and you're just basically reproducing that shape of the cloud on the paper using the piece of Kleenex. You can also soften or elongate the clouds just by dragging that Kleenex over the top of the paper. Then after that is done, you'll want to come back in with your light gray again and looking at your resource photo, seeing where those grays are located. And then you're going to come back in with your brush that's clean and damp and soften those edges because some of those edges on the shadows are too sharp. They need to be softened. And one final step that I like to use in this technique is simply to add a darker blue to the sky, and that increases the contrast so you can see the clouds a lot better. I believe I have this in a cream consistency, a little bit thicker. And if needed, you can come back in and spritz it lightly again. And also softening. I don't think there's anything I enjoy more than sitting on the porch and watching the clouds go by when the sun is setting and seeing those silver line clouds. This resource photo is one that I took when we were on vacation in Hartselle, Colorado. Such a beautiful view. We're going to start our painting by drawing the horizon line, making sure you're drawing it lightly, but understanding that rule of thirds. Even if in the photograph, if the horizon is up higher, you need to move it down lower so it's in the bottom third, or up higher so it's in the top third. I'm also coming in and just drawing a really rough drawing of where the trees are. In preparing the paper for paint, you need to remember that you're going to only paint where the clouds are. So making that part of the paper wet is going to be a really good effect. Coming in and negative painting the clouds now, and this is with cerulean blue, notice how I'm holding my brush sideways. I'm only painting the sky. I'm not painting the clouds. And that allows the paint to do a wet into wet right where those clouds are. Now, you can just leave this alone the way it is, or what we're going to do is we're going to come in and paint some mid-tones and some darker tones so that the contrast in the sky is really high. I'm coming in with another brush load of paint just because I didn't think that the shadows were dark enough. And I'm adding that darker glazing technique just to make the clouds look a little bit more three-dimensional. Also remember that down at the bottom, closer to the horizon line, those clouds are going to be much smaller. It gives it a perspective. It makes it look like it's farther away. Now I'm coming in with a very dark gray, adding a little bit more of the Payne's gray into the mixture. And since that wet it down, I'm adding I add a little bit more Payne's gray, and that is probably the darkest I'm going to go. I'm looking at the photograph and noticing where the darkest place on the photograph is, and also on the clouds, to make sure that it gives it some distance and gives it some depth. I decided to spritz the clouds just because I felt that I wanted them to be more misty looking. And then I'm taking a paper towel here and lifting up places where I thought it needed to be lighter. So I'm building up that contrast as we're going. Taking the hairdryer and drying it all down. And then, noticing that things have lightened up a little bit, I'm going to intensify that dark again. Once again, holding my paintbrush sideways enables you to get just a little bit more detail, a little bit of texture of the paper showing. Don't worry about the straight edges right now. We're going to come back in just a minute and we're going to soften those edges. And the way we're going to soften those edges is by taking a clean brush, rinsed out with water, and we're going to wipe it down so that it's just damp, doesn't have hardly any water in it. And then we're just going to rub right on those edges, and that's going to soften it down. And here we go. So softening those edges, you can see how I dip it in the water and then wipe it off with a paper towel and then rub it on those sections. Now you only want to rub just one little section at a time. You can't go over the whole thing just by doing that once, because you're lifting up color. That's what you're doing to soften that area. And this just makes that darkened area look a little bit more cloud-like. After it dried completely, I felt that the blue sky needed a little bit more value. So I took some more of the cerulean and mixed in a little bit of cobalt this time and added a little bit more blue to the sky. Now we're going to add our white gouache. Two different ways that you can use this gouache. You can use it straight from the tube, just sticking your brush in. You can see how I'm kind of mixing it up. And you want to have a smaller brush for this, a small round brush. And then just looking at the photograph and seeing where those highlights are, where that silver lining is on the clouds in the sky. Now the other way that you can do this is that you can take and just squeeze out a little bit of the gouache onto your palette and then just mix it up really good. I do that a little bit later when I needed a little bit more gouache on my brush, especially right in the center where I want to bump up the white where the sun is shining through. This is what really gives your clouds some dimension, because you have the lightest tones, you have the mid-tones, and you have the darker tones. Coming back in again with the darker tones. Never hurts to come back in and add some darks if they're not dark enough. And I spritzed them a little bit and took my paper towel again and wiped it down a little bit. I was just lifting up some, and I didn't want that darkened to go into the lighter spots. And especially on that cloud on the right, you can really see how it's building up the dimension with each thing that I'm doing. Now this is where I take the paint right from the palette and use the gouache right from the palette and really make those areas show. Now to create the sun rays coming out, you want to have just a little bit of gouache on your brush, and your brush needs to be dry. So you can dragging it across the paper and doing a dry brush technique. You may want to practice this on another piece of paper before you do it here, but you can see how doing a dry brush allows you to see the texture of the paper really easily. Now we're going into our glazing, and this is a mixture of quinacridone gold and a little bit of cerulean. Practice this on another piece of paper before you put it down on your paper, because you don't want it to be too green. Again, it's not about the landscape, it's about that sky. You need to dry it after each glaze. Now I made the glaze a little bit darker, and I'm coming in with my second layer of glaze. What I have to do sometimes is in the middle of this, creating that glaze, just dip the tip of your brush in the water, and that tends to make that paint go a little bit farther and a little bit easier to paint over that large area and to create that wash. Now I'm doing it a third glaze, and this time I'm looking specifically at details where there's little hills or little roads that create that darkness. Once you have the main part of your painting finished and it's dry, that's an important piece to make sure that foreground area is dry, then you're able to come in with your paint. And this is my green mixture mixed with a little bit of the Payne's gray, and to paint in the foreground. And the foreground has these wonderful trees right there on the side. And again, this is a view that I had when I was staying in Hartselle, Colorado this summer, and so it was a good memory for me to remember what this looked like. But anyway, so just coming in, putting in your details, taking your time, being careful not to smear it with your hand as you're working. Now if you are painting trees like this, best way to do it is to come in with a line and then kind of bounce your paintbrush back and forth to create it. You can see I've got a line here, and this is a little bush, so it's not really one of the trees, but making sure that you're thinking also about perspective. Some of the trees are lighter than the others. Here's one that those two bushes are in the background. However, this one here is more in the foreground, and also use some overlapping. You're not going to see much space in between the trees because they will overlap, and again that will create some distance there. Also, don't forget the shadows. Because of the sun being very bright, there's going to be a definite shadow coming from each one of these trees. And so I added that. Once I had kind of a very light shadow down, then I came in with the darker green value and made the shadows. Coming in, adding some trees down there in the distance. Don't keep it all one color. Come in with some shadows on the trees themselves. Don't just paint them with one color because there will be some dark areas and some light areas together. I found a place up here in the sky that I wanted to have more white, so I touched it up just a little bit. I got some gouache in a spot I didn't want it, so I just took a wet brush and kind of blending it in to that hill. I'm going to put a little bit of paint on it now, cover that up a little bit. And here's the finished painting. Now that we've kind of wrapped things up on the projects that we have here in this class, I have some questions for you. First of all, why does gouache work better than watercolor for painting the light rays? In your experience when you were doing this, what did you find when you were using the gouache, and how was it better than using the watercolor? Second question, what is glaze in watercolor? What does that mean when we're doing glazing? Third, why is knowing the paint consistency so important? When we did the tea to butter activity, why is it important to know that? What were some specific things that we talked about, and why will that be something important for you to know? Finally, what is the easiest way to create contrast in a painting? You heard me mention contrast several different times when we were doing the different activities. And contrast just means light up against dark. So what's the easiest way to do that when we're painting? So why does gouache work better than watercolor for light rays? That's because it's thicker and it's opaque, which means you can't see through it. What is glaze in watercolor? Where you're layering paint on top of each other, layering one paint after the first has dried. So it's really important that you take that hairdryer and dry it down, and then you just put another layer, and then possibly even several layers so you get the value that you're looking for. Why is knowing the paint consistency important, the tea to butter? And the most important reason for this is to increase the control of the paint when you're using it. Control is so important. For instance, if you have too watery of paint when you're doing details, it's going to end up running all over the place. Whereas if you have a thicker consistency, it's going to work better. Finally, what is the easiest way to create contrast in a painting? If you use a light value up against a dark value. Kind of mentioned the value process, but it's when you have a color that's really, really dark up against something that's really, really light to create that contrast. I hope that you've enjoyed this class, and I hope it's encouraged you to try some of the different techniques that we've talked about.